Assassin's Creed Shadows from Ubisoft has been updated from the launch code, improving things and changing stuff on the PlayStation 5 Pro version. I haven't looked at it myself, but my friend and colleague Oliver McKenzie has. And Oliver, how you doing there?
I'm doing well, Alex. I'm doing well, and I'm excited to talk about the latest update to AC Shadows today.
Yeah, so basically we knew at launch that the game didn't have PSSR there, as well as the balance mode didn't have stuff like ray traced reflections. And I had an interview with a number of the core developers on the technical side, and they mentioned that they wanted to target a patch adding those things in. So Oliver, what are the results of that patch as you're seeing here?
Yeah, so I think this is interesting. This patch basically includes everything they promised to you in that interview, which is good. It's patch 1.02, and it's available, I believe, on all platforms, although the kind of key upgrades here we're going to be talking about today are present on PlayStation 5 Pro consoles. So the biggest change here by far on PS5 Pro, I think, is the introduction of PSSR, which is enabled through a toggle in the settings menu. Now, if I compare the two side by side in performance mode, the PSSR view and the TAAU view, the PSSR view looks more stable. It tends to have less obvious aliasing. In stills, there's less of that kind of jittery temporal breakup on the ground and in the foliage. And that's really what we're concerned a lot with temporal anti-aliasing techniques. Like sometimes that kind of jitteriness at rest can give you a little bit of image quality gremlins there. It's not so great there. And the PSSR version is just doing a much better job, I think. It does a much better job of resolving those really fine and subpixel details at a distance without breakup or shimmer like these bamboo stalks here. It's quite nice. And on the fine lines of this railing here, PSSR actually managed to hold like a pretty stable and coherent little highlight there, while the TAAU was kind of mangling it. In terms of the foliage rendition, PSSR has a very different, but perhaps preferable version of the foliage, where TAAU has a kind of grainy and sharp look, and PSSR looks a little bit more blurry, but it's kind of like, it's a less visually conspicuous depiction of foliage, where it's not standing out as much. It's a little bit more blurred, a little bit better anti-aliasing on that. I kind of prefer it personally. I think the SSR is better as well. It has kind of that blurred over averaged look a little bit with PSSR, but I actually kind of prefer that a little bit relative to the more artifact-ridden TAAU. The only real compromises here in terms of image quality with PSSR come down to particles, which can suffer from trails with PSSR, and the TAAU doesn't really have that issue. This is most obvious in the opening shot of the game here, where if you look closely, you can spot it pretty badly, and you can spot it elsewhere in the game as well, but like these little fiery particles here that's showing off some significant trails. The other compromise lies in clarity, and this can be noticed basically everywhere in the game, where the PSSR rendition of the title just looks a little bit softer in every shot, more or less. This may or may not be noticeable to you though, like I can show you these great 400% zoom ins here, but in typical play, would you really notice this sitting at typical viewing distance from a television? And whereas like those little aliasing flickers and pop-ups and things like that, you will often notice those from a more, from a wide range of viewing distances from a television or monitor. If we start moving the camera around here, some of those differences get amplified a bit in favor of PSSR. Like if I'm rotating the camera in this shot, the difference in image stability on the foliage here on those blades of wheat is pretty gigantic. PSSR just does a much better job with artifacting on foliage. And when we push through other scenes in the game, we tend to see a better overall image presentation with PSSR with much less aliasing. It's a much more coherent looking image with some kind of like, again, machine learning style artifacts, some kind of blurs. When detail gets disoccluded, sometimes you see a little bit of blur there. But in general, I prefer that to kind of the analytical artifacts you get with their TAAU, which are quite numerous, I think. Now, if we go back to the launch patch and compare that with the current patch with TAAU enabled, just as a bit of a sanity check, it looks very, very similar. So I suspect, in terms of the overall appearance of this game, there haven't been many changes between the launch patch and update 1.02, aside from the addition of that PSSR on PS5 Pro. In quality mode, the situation is pretty similar, but the baseline image quality here with TAAU is a lot better, so I'm not finding it as much of a difference there. Like they both look pretty comparable in general. They both look pretty clean. They both look pretty free of artifacts. But the clarity of PSSR here is more comparable to that TAAU, so the clarity is brought up a little bit. It's not quite as soft. And there are still some trails I noticed, but actually the trail issue doesn't seem as bad here, curiously enough. So that's a nice improvement.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of pixel counts, I had kind of 3 shots set up. that I did the exact same camera pan on and got the exact same edge on and counted the exact same spot on. So this should be pretty accurate stuff. But I did some pixel counts here in performance mode, and I'm putting those on the screen now. Basically, if you compare the launch patch in its performance mode versus the new patch with TAAU, the results are basically the same in my tests. No surprises there, because you're still dealing with TAAU and you're still dealing with a 60 FPS target. But the new patch with PSSR runs much lower on average at about 864p or so in my testing, which is actually the minimum I believe PSSR can go for a 2160p output. It does a 2.5x scale at maximum there, according to Mark Cerny. So that is, I guess, at the limit of what, at least what they advise for the technique. I think one issue here that they're running into is just like with that DRS lower bound, you know, PSSR to 4K costs 2 milliseconds. And when we're talking about a 16.67666 repeating frame time, 2 milliseconds is a pretty big chunk of that. So the idea that they're going significantly down in resolution here makes a lot of sense. For the quality mode, I have the quality mode results on screen right now. And it's more equivocal, like there is a small deficit in favor of TAAU here, but it's not that significant. And I just expect that 2 millisecond upscale cost. It's a lot less significant at 30 FPS, but I don't know what you think about that, Alex. It seems like a pretty positive story so far.
Yeah, and it's also interesting how it lines up with the pre-release footage we had of Assassin's Creed Shadows, if you recall that, where we were getting 864p counts back then on stuff. So I guess this is kind of that, which we're seeing right now in the post-launch version of the game. Yeah. Regarding some of the artifacting, I would vastly prefer an image that is much more stable, if not a little bit softer, than one that I've played the game with TAAU on PC and I immediately switched to DLSS because I thought when you would pan the camera, all the foliage in the game, of which there is a lot, even though the game has cities, most of this is, during a time period when you didn't have concrete streets everywhere and there was still a lot of natural environments in the world. And you just see a lot of breakup. Like horizontal aliasing essentially across the entire image when you pan the camera. And I found that much more distracting than any sort of level of clarity loss that you would see here. So I prefer in all the images that you sent to me, the PSSR image by quite a bit. It does, there are some, there are obviously some artifacts that you get there, but I think they're probably worth it in the end. It is interesting to see, though, that once again, we're seeing just kind of like the heavier costs on the input resolution here with PSSR 864p. Not the first time we've seen it where a game has to drop res to maintain these in comparison to what it is the internal resolution without PSSR. It's not too surprising. I prefer the image. In terms of the quality mode thing, though, that's more of like a whatever you prefer. I think the good thing about PSSR in general, though, here is it's going to be more forward-looking. TAAU is going to be static, whereas the more input res you're going to be feeding into the PSSR model, it's going to get just better and better, I presume. So with something like a PS6 down the line, I'm pretty sure this version of the game will look better than what the TAAU version could have ever looked like. So I think that's all really good. But the question is, okay, so they're dropping a little bit of res to make that performance deficit up from enabling PSSR, but does it maintain performance is like the question that I have for you, Oliver.
Yeah, that's kind of the key question, I guess, if that PSSR is worth it. So unfortunately, I do have to report back some slightly negative news here, which is that in the performance mode, the PSSR technique carries a pretty substantial frame time penalty there and a pretty substantial frame rate penalty. When we walk around the world, it can drop frames pretty frequently, and we often end up in like the mid-50s or so, especially around Kyoto. That's kind of the biggest city in the game. That seems particularly taxing. It also tends to suffer from the game's kind of DRS issues particularly badly as well. Like when you swing the camera. So if I look at this idle shot at the beginning of the game, I'm getting 57 FPS. If I look straight up, 60, right? But then if I swing the camera back down, we're falling into the 40s briefly before we settle at like 57 FPS again. So the game's DRS is just maybe not quite as aggressive as maybe it ideally should be possibly in these scenarios to actually maintain a more stable frame rate. If we go over to TAAU, it's not perfect. Again, we kind of documented this at launch, but the performance level is pretty good and it's not dropping frames nearly as often. There's one interesting note here, though, which is that Ubisoft removed the FPS lock in the hideout, which is quite nice. So it now runs at a 60 FPS update here with TAAU. Of course, this is like very early content. I'm showing a pretty early slice of the game. Maybe later on in the game with a big, fully kitted out hideout customized to the gills, maybe you could get some bigger frame rate drops, but so far it's running pretty well for me. But with PSSR, unfortunately, the hideout does not run at a stable 60 FPS, of course, so that is a bit unfortunate. I'm not super happy with the performance of the PSSR performance mode overall. It could just be that they're bottoming out resolution at something like 864p, may not be able to go too much lower without decreasing the output resolution or having some issues there. I think the performance level is fine enough for VRR play. And I did, just before this call, I did test the game in an extended session in a part of the game where the frame rate was constantly dropping. And I didn't note any VRR stutter even after like 30 minutes, 40 minutes of leaving it running. So that should at least be fine. I don't think you'll have issues there, at least in my testing. I also tested the quality mode with PSSR, which is a little bit less dramatic. It can drop frames from time to time, like if you swing the camera wildly, but it's typically a locked 30 FPS without any real issues. But that was also true with TAAU before, so it's not too surprising there. So far, in those 60 hertz modes, maybe not ideal in terms of performance, but not too bad if you have a VRR display, basically.
They give you the choice, at least. It's a lot better than a patch that would just enable PSSR and have or worse image quality or worse performance, and you couldn't do anything about it. So at least if you do have like a non-VRR display, but I imagine most people with the PS5 Pro probably have a VRR display these days, that at least they have that TAAU option still there, which holds the VSync line much better. But obviously, like I said also in my video at launch, the DRS in this game is a bit lazy, as I always call it, where it's not very aggressively dropping the frames, the frame size and stuff, probably for, I would assume, image quality reasons, because large drops, like stuff with FSR, for example, we know that when FSR has DRS frame drops, you can sometimes see a fizzle in the entire image. Tom's documented that a couple times before. But here they give you the option. I obviously would like it to be more consistent than it is right now, but that's just kind of the way the cookie crumbles here when PSSR has a much higher cost. And the thing is, the higher the baseline cost of anything that is fixed is, like, PSSR's cost is going to be relatively fixed across, regardless of whatever the input resolution is. That means you have to be actually more aggressive with dynamic resolution because it has to make up more of that frame time cost, essentially. That's one of the downsides of having higher fixed costs with DRS. But okay, so you've gone through performance mode and quality mode. Quality mode seems pretty great, actually. What about balance mode?
Yeah. So I kind of wanted to close out with just like two topics that they did make some changes, where they did make some changes. So starting off with the balance mode, the big update to the balance mode is that they've given the game specular RT, or RT reflections in other words, which is a nice bonus. It definitely improves the reflections on bodies of water when you pan the camera down, when you lose that SSR information in screen space. Definitely looks quite a lot nicer. But if we just look at these kind of like really glossy surfaces and things like that, it's not the most like detailed representation of the world sometimes here, but it's still a pretty nice fallback, and it's nice to have it for sure. The balance mode also gets PSSR, and I tested the performance here, which is shakier than with TAAU. It drops pretty frequently, especially in Kyoto and in the game's opening, which are two quite demanding sections. Again, I would say here with VRR, with LFC, it should be pretty fine. Without VRR, it's not very good. So basically pick your poison there in terms of TAAU versus PSSR. You can kind of pick if you have VRR, but if you don't have VRR, I would suggest TAAU here. But it's maybe not as bad even without VRR as the performance mode, just because the drops aren't quite as steep, and the frame time variance at 120 hertz output, you're dealing with like 8.3 milliseconds of frame time variance there as opposed to 16.6. So a little bit less noticeable with that higher refresh. The hideout performance also goes to 40 FPS here, which is nice, but unfortunately with PSSR, it doesn't hit it too often. So I would do more image quality comparisons here, but I'm limited by my capture hardware in terms of getting really accurate image quality out of that mode. So suffice to say that, at least in my own testing, it basically follows the other two modes in terms of that PSSR versus TAAU breakdown, where PSSR is delivering a markedly better image very often. But there's also an HDR issue with PSSR for some reason. So the issue is basically that certain elements of the game's lighting exhibit these colored halos that resemble a kind of banding type artifact. So I've captured it here by looking right up at the sun. But the footage, the problem is that in person, this is quite noticeable. But when I take this like Rec 2020 footage into Final Cut and have it mapped into SDR, you can't really see it. So I've modified the footage here in this shot kind of crudely to give a better impression of how the highlights actually appear on like a proper high brightness HDR television. And you should be able to see like this band of bluish green around the sun in this shot.
Right.
It's a little bit of an obvious artifact there. There have been reports of it elsewhere in the game, and I have observed it, I think, in certain foggy conditions where you see gradients and where light is trailing off. Sometimes you see it, but it's most clear in this shot. Your ability to see it is going to depend on your panel and your HDR settings, like depending on where you have the white point set, depending on where you have the brightest point set, maximum luminance, whatever. Depending also on how you have tone mapping set on your panel, HGIG, different settings possibly can come into this. But at least for me, it was like mildly noticeable if I knew what to look for, which I was informed by the peanut gallery what to do here. Right. So I was able to figure it out. Otherwise, I don't think I would have noticed, honestly, in typical play. Probably not. But this is probably something that Ubisoft should fix, and I see they've acknowledged it on their support website, so hopefully they will get around to fixing it. But overall, I think this is a solid enough patch. I wish I could recommend the PSSR mode without caveats, and I almost can, but it's just that presentation without VRR that kind of gets in the way. With VRR, I don't really think you're going to notice the dips too much there. I think it's basically fine. And it's at 60 FPS a good amount of the time anyways, so it's not too bad. The balanced mode has been improved with the RT reflections. That's quite nice. And the balanced and performance modes get to stretch their wings a bit with an unlocked frame rate in the hideout area, which again is nice. In the early game, at least, it runs very well. It's a nice set of upgrades, and if they can fix those slight issues with HDR and clean up some of the performance concerns, I think that should be pretty good. And they also discussed, I noticed they discussed in the PlayStation blog, they discussed some of their experiences with PSSR, and they said they worked quite closely with Sony, and apparently Sony provided them with updated model parameters late in the game to hopefully improve their implementation of PSSR. So hopefully we're seeing here, maybe with a combination of model updates and some tweaks on Ubisoft's end, hopefully we are seeing a bit of an overall improvement to the state of PSSR. And in this title, as with Kingdom Come Deliverance, which came out recently, I think the PSSR presentation is good, and it's markedly better than competing analytical upscalers. You know, in Kingdom Come's case, that was FSR. In this game's case, it was Anvil's built-in TAAU, which, like, for an analytical upscaler that works on console is not bad by any means, but PSSR certainly does a much better job here. So I don't know if you have any kind of concluding thoughts on this patch, Alex. Yeah. I think it's a pretty positive story for the most part.
Yeah, generally very positive. I think the image quality upgrades you're getting across the board when you do flip on PSSR are probably going to be worth it for most players. It's just a shame that the cost of it all does have to be on overall frame rate. Obviously, there would be ways around that if they allowed the floor for DRS to be lower. If that even works with PSSR. You mentioned the 2.5x axis scale. Like, I don't know if it's a hard limit or if it's just the way the
maybe they only trained it on that content.
They only trained it on that. Maybe, like earlier models of DLSS, for example, used different presets with different weights based upon the input resolution. DLAA and ultra performance mode 720p up to 4K, for example, use slightly different model than the normal DLSS. So maybe it has to do with that. It's really hard to know exactly why there is this limit apparently out there of 864p from 4K. But yeah, I mean, in general, it seems like a good update. I would just like to see the HDR cleaned up. But Oliver, that was some pretty nice, quick work from you there. Good job.
Yeah, it was a pleasure as always, Alex.
Yeah. But yeah, if you did enjoy this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell for instant notifications, support us on Patreon. And this is Oliver and Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.